Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really important and pretty complex topic, the state of education in the U.S.
Yeah, there's a lot going on.
We've gathered a whole range of sources for you. Everything from a detailed report on school discipline in Ohio, that's from the Children's Defense Fund,
Hmm.
to analyses of recent federal executive orders. Think Brookings Institution, Education Council, ANACAC, that sort of thing.
Right, and we're also bringing in views from educators, unions, research on discipline practices themselves.
Exactly. Our goal here is to kind of synthesize all these different viewpoints, give you a clear picture of what's happening, on the ground and at the policy level, a shortcut to getting up to speed.
For sure. And as we've looked through all this material, two main themes, they really jump out.
Really?
First, we're going to explore the current trends and, frankly, the ongoing issues in school discipline. We'll focus particularly on those exclusionary practices, suspensions, expulsions.
Got it. And the second,
Then we'll shift gears and look at the pretty significant impact of recent federal executive orders, how they're affecting K-12 and higher education.
okay, sounds like a plan. It's a lot to unpack, definitely.
It is, but we'll guide you through the most crucial bits.
Great. So let's start with school discipline then and dive into that Ohio report. Something that immediately jumped out at me was this overall trend.
Yeah.
Well, it seems like while there's been some progress maybe in reducing exclusionary discipline for the really young kids, like pre-K through third grade.
The SAFE Act effect.
Right. But across the state, overall, these practices are actually, well, they're increasing again at all the other grade levels.
That's a key finding. If you look at the data from just 2021-22 compared to 2022-23, the report shows a definite rise in out-of-school suspensions and expulsions.
And that's PK-12.
Every grade level, PK right through 12. So it suggests, while those early interventions might help initially, the underlying reasons for these disciplinary actions seem to get stronger as kids get older.
And this isn't happening in a vacuum, right? The report connects it back, goes back to the tough on crime rhetoric of the 80s and 90s.
Absolutely. And that whole super predator theory idea.
Yeah, which was, well, widely discredited later.
Exactly. But it reminds us how those narratives about youth crime really shaped how we approach school discipline and, importantly, how those approaches often got tangled up with long-standing issues of racism.
That historical context feels really important here, understanding why some of these practices are so, well, baked into the system.
It is key. That super predator idea, even though debunked, it fueled this climate of, increased youth criminalization. And the report points out this really reinforced existing racial biases in schools. Big impact on how discipline gets handed out.
Okay, so Ohio brought in the SAFE Act, right, to try and curb some of this in the early grades. And the report says it did have some positive effects. But here's the kicker. Even with the SAFE Act, there were still nearly 2,000 cases of exclusionary discipline for PK3 kids in 2022-23.
Wow, nearly 2,000.
Yeah, and for behaviors that weren't covered by the immediate health and safety exemptions. And get this, that number was actually up slightly from the year before.
So what does that tell us? Maybe just limiting the practice isn't enough if you don't address the root causes.
That seems to be the implication. It's a step, maybe, but not the whole solution. Perhaps it points to other issues, like, do teachers have the right support? What kind of behaviors are we even talking about?
And we get some insight there. There's a quote from a superintendent, right, expressing real concern about middle school suspensions specifically.
Yeah, and they mentioned a big problem, limited counseling resources. They contracted with an outside service, but it's stretched really thin.
That perspective from the ground level, it just highlights that you need more than policy tweaks. You need infrastructure.
Resources.
Yeah, resources, especially counseling, mental health support, to actually tackle the why behind the behavior. Without that, alternatives are hard to implement.
And when you look at why kids are getting punished, it's pretty revealing.
What does the data show?
In 2022-23, only about 29% of out-of-school punishments were for fighting or violence.
Okay, less than a third.
Right. Nearly half, almost 50% were just labeled disobedient, disruptive behavior.
Wow. That's broad.
Incredibly broad, and seems wide open to interpretation, doesn't it?
Totally. And that's where the report brings up this issue of discretion, what counts as disruptive. It seems that definition has broadened over time.
Which opens the door for, well, unequal consequences for maybe minor things.
Exactly. And this is where that link between potential educator bias and discipline decisions really comes into focus.
And the report doesn't pull punches on racial bias. It highlights pretty significant gaps in discipline between Black and white students.
Yeah, that gap peaked around 2015-16, dipped a bit, but now it's widening again, which is alarming.
It is. And it's really significant that Black students are disciplined more often for that same vague category, disobedient, disruptive behavior.
That strongly suggests, implicit bias might be at play. If kids from different backgrounds get different consequences for the same subjective infraction.
It points to perceptions being different based on race.
Right.
We even hear that directly from a high school student in the report. They talk about zero-tolerance policies being unfairly enforced against minorities.
That student perspective is so valuable.
And they made another really sharp point. For some kids, getting suspended out of school isn't really a punishment. It can almost be seen as a reward.
That challenges the whole premise, doesn't it? If removal isn't a deterrent.
Exactly. And they stress the need for more in-school options for students who are being disruptive, keep them engaged, but manage the behavior.
It really calls for more creative, more supportive approaches, not just removal.
So putting all this together, the Children's Defense Fund report lays out some pretty clear recommendations.
Like what?
Well, they want more funding for the SAFE Act and to expand it beyond PK3, especially into elementary grades.
Makes sense if the problems increase later.
They also call for completely ending the state's zero-tolerance mandate and boosting funding for counselors, social-emotional support, using the state's Fair School funding plan.
Okay, so it's a shift towards prevention and support, really. Moving away from just removing kids and towards fixing the harm, addressing the underlying issues.
And it's not just on the schools. The report also emphasizes how crucial parent engagement is.
Yeah, creating positive school climates. They mentioned parents organizing a teacher appreciation night.
Exactly, strengthening those connections. It's a team effort.
Absolutely. When parents and educators collaborate, it just builds a stronger community for the students.
We also get this really powerful quote from a fifth-grade teacher. They basically say suspension, expulsion, they don't solve anything.
Blocked.
And they point out the disproportionate impact on Black and brown students, but then they raise something interesting, a potential link to the curriculum.
How so?
Suggesting that maybe kids disengage, maybe act out if they don't see themselves reflected in what they're learning.
That's a really thought-provoking connection. It shows how discipline isn't isolated. It connects to the whole educational experience, belonging, engagement.
Right, which leads into the discussion about restorative practices.
Yeah, that shift away from just punishment towards, repairing harm, rebuilding relationships.
But the report is realistic. It says these practices, they need resources. They need time.
They're not a magic wand.
No. You need things like a multi-tiered system of support, MTSS. You need staff buy-in. You need to figure out what capacity you already have.
Identify who's going to lead the charge.
And really listen to students, staff, parents. Focus on the whole learner.
It's a fundamental shift, isn't it? Requires real commitment, training, resources, changing the whole school culture. Not a quick fix.
And then you hear from other teachers just painting this picture of daily challenges. Lack of admin support comes up a lot. Feeling pressure sometimes to underreport discipline incidents, maybe to make school ratings look better.
Oof, that's concerning.
Yeah. And the perception that both ISS in-school suspension and OSS out of school can sometimes just feel like holidays to the students.
Not effective deterrents, then.
Or that in-class suspension just sets kids up to fail.
These first-hand accounts, they really drive home the gap between policy ideals and classroom reality. The frustration is palpable.
There's this recurring theme. Consequences should fit the behavior and involve resolution, maybe an apology.
Context matters too, right? First offense versus repeat behavior.
Definitely. And teachers worry about chronically disruptive students impacting everyone else's learning. That's a tough one.
And the whole idea issues students with IEPs. Balancing leniency, accountability, when behavior might or might not be related to their disability. It's complex.
It's super complex. And sadly, that perception of bias and who gets accused, who gets punished, it keeps coming up.
It really highlights that there's no single, simple answer here. Educators are juggling so much.
The report even brings up the principle of non-maleficence, do no harm.
Yeah, suggesting policymakers should really prioritize that. Maybe empower teachers and principals more as the default decision makers.
And again, the call for more resources, social workers specifically, to deal with underlying stuff like homelessness, lack of support at home.
That do no harm idea is a powerful lens. Shifts focus from punishment that can have negative long-term effects towards support. and more social workers connect student well-being directly to academic success.
Finally, the report touches on a few other key things. Widespread opposition to corporal punishment. All the major health education groups are against it.
Right. It's prohibited in Head Start, military schools, prisons.
Importance of trauma-informed discipline, too, focusing on safety, trust, peer support, empowering kids, giving them space to self-regulate.
And being aware of microaggressions, discrimination against students of color, kids with disabilities, LGBTQ+ students.
It all points towards needing a system that's not just fair, but also really sensitive to the diverse needs and experiences kids bring to school.
Absolutely. Recognizing trauma, being mindful of bias, essential for truly supportive schools.
Okay, let's shift gears now. Federal executive orders. The Trump administration definitely brought some major changes and proposed changes through these actions.
A really prominent theme was, well, the rhetoric around potentially dismantling the Department of Education entirely.
Right. They talked about a failing system, low reading and math scores, often using NIEP data.
But analyses from places like Brookings push back on that narrative.
Yeah.
They argue it's a bit misleadingly negative.
How so?
Well, they point out that long-term NIEP trends actually show gains over time. And the bar for proficiency on NIEP is set pretty high.
Plus, it's hard to pin student learning directly on the DOE, isn't it?
Very difficult to isolate that impact. And importantly, most DOE spending isn't even on K-12. It's higher ed student loans mostly. Federal K-12 funding is only about, 10% of the total?
Tiny fraction, relatively speaking.
Right. And we know former President Trump said repeatedly he wanted to shut down the DOE. But even administration officials acknowledged that would actually require Congress to act.
But even short of a full shutdown, there was that executive order improving education outcomes by empowering parents, states, and communities.
Yeah, analyses suggested the aim was to facilitate closure as much as legally possible, return power to states and localities.
And critically, tie remaining federal funds to the administration's policy goals, like ending DEI initiatives and what they called gender ideology.
But that focus rolling back DEI, targeting gender ideology, that's a thread running through several EOs. The one on ending radical indoctrination in K-12 schooling is a key example.
Right. Aimed at eliminating what they saw as discriminatory treatment and indoctrination based on those concepts, while boosting parental rights.
And they actually define terms. Discriminatory equity ideology was framed as treating people as group members, downplaying agency and merit based on race.
And social transition was defined simply as adopting a gender identity.
We also saw the reestablishment of the President's Advisory 1776 Commission.
Promoting patriotic education.
Yeah, directing agencies, including the Department of Education, to promote that through history and civics programs.
Then came the EO on ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity. This one seemed to go further.
How so?
Aiming to eliminate DEI beyond just the federal government, targeting race and sex-based preferences as potentially violating civil rights laws.
And it specifically mentioned guidance related to the Supreme Court's Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard decision.
Right. And requiring certifications against DEI programs in federal contracts, grants, calling for ways to end illegal DEI discrimination in the private sector, too.
Targeting investigations of big nonprofits, foundations, universities with large endowments. It was broad.
And then the EO on defending women from gender ideology extremism. This one directly clashed with the Biden administration's Title IX rules on transgender student protections.
Yes, leading the Office for Civil Rights, the OCR, to issue a Dear Colleague letter citing these Trump EOs. And reports indicated the administration moved quickly to investigate institutions with trans-inclusive policies.
Seems like a clear priority for them, redefining discrimination and challenging those protections.
The speed of those investigations suggests so, yes.
And there were others in a similar vein, keeping men out of women's sports. EOs on eradicating anti-Christian bias, combating anti-Semitism.
The overall messaging emphasized merit, common sense school discipline.
And explicitly rejected disparate impact theories.
Right. And it directed new school discipline guidance within 60 days, plus a review of nonprofits promoting equity-based discipline. A clear shift away from looking at systemic disparities.
Interestingly, amidst all this, there was also an EO on artificial intelligence, AI.
What did that one do?
Called for a federal task force for AI training, even for K-12 students, developing online resources.
So recognizing the need to align education with tech innovation, the changing workforce.
Seems like it. And let's not forget the EO on historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs.
Aiming to empower them, promote private sector partnerships.
Right. A continued focus there, though maybe viewed within the broader context of the administration's stance on equity.
Good point. Now, of course, these EOs didn't just happen. There were legal challenges.
Lots of them. It's interesting, many EOs have that standard general provisions language.
Yeah, saying they don't impair existing authority, subject to law, don't create new rights, boilerplate stuff, often.
But challenges were still mounted. Based on the appointments clause, were advisors bypassing confirmed officials. Based on the Federal Advisory Committee Act, FACA transparency concerns.
And we saw courts issue temporary restraining orders, TROs, and preliminary injunctions, PIs, against agencies like DOE over data disclosure.
That National Association of Diversity Officers case resulted in a nationwide injunction against several EOs, though it got stayed later.
Right. And other challenges argued First Amendment free speech, Fifth Amendment vagueness, separation of powers, ultra vires acting beyond authority.
And in the trans rights cases, plaintiffs often got preliminary relief from the courts.
There were even challenges to that EO about birthright citizenship based on the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause.
Raised huge constitutional questions, that one.
Yep.
Outside of pure education, there was also an EO on workforce development reshaping government training, emphasizing trades.
And one on higher education accreditation.
Yeah, trying to make it easier for colleges to switch accreditors, streamline approval for new ones.
The stated goal: force accreditors to focus on merit and results, not woke ideology.
Which could be huge since accreditation is tied to federal student aid eligibility.
Absolutely. A potential disruption to the whole higher ed landscape, fitting those broader themes we've seen.
And then there was the NIH grants guidance setting a standard 15% indirect cost rate.
Which could really hit research institutions hard, right? Sparked lawsuits from state AGs.
Shows how these policies spread beyond just the ed department, affecting science funding, too.
A really significant action was rescinding the Obama-era school discipline guidance.
Yeah, the Trump administration called it too heavy-handed, stifling local control. Said teachers know best.
They even cited a new report they claimed backed up their decision.
But it's worth remembering, right, that the Obama guidance encouraged limiting suspensions, using restorative justice.
But the underlying civil rights rules, requiring schools to collect discipline data, those stayed in place.
Right, so the data collection continued, even without the specific guidance.
Now, the impact on academic research itself was also a big concern.
Huge uncertainty for scientists with federal funding, wasn't there? Bans on funding BEI, gender ideology, even green energy research.
Yeah, led to NIH and NSF pausing grant reviews. Some STEM diversity programs actually got terminated, like one at Northern Arizona University.
And new certification requirements popped up for NIH funding related to DEI and boycotts of Israel.
Created a real chilling effect, you could say. Raised questions about academic freedom, the future of research in those areas. Major disruption.
And bringing it back to teachers and discipline, we have some specific insights on reform from their perspective. Echoes some of the Ohio stuff.
Like what?
Similar views on behavior challenges in high-poverty schools, regardless of the teacher's race. And this worry that maybe suspension numbers went down because of admin pressure.
Not because behavior actually improved, just making the numbers look good.
That's the concern raised, feeling like safety issues were sometimes ignored to keep reports clean.
That's deeply troubling.
And, significantly, a majority of teachers surveyed felt the downsides of out-of-school suspension do not outweigh the benefits.
A disconnect between policy goals and classroom experience, perhaps.
Teachers also saw different purposes for OSS, messaging parents maybe, versus ISS, keeping kids on track academically.
But ISS often seen as ineffective, a joke or holiday.
Yeah, and in-class suspension may be setting kids up to fail. Again, the call for consequences to fit the behavior involve resolution.
Context matters, first time versus repeat offense.
Right. And a high percentage of teachers in high-poverty schools felt they had chronically disruptive students needing more support than they could give in a regular class.
And the IDA complexities again. Plus, sadly, teacher awareness of racial bias in discipline actions. These perspectives really ground the policy talk in classroom reality, shows the complexity of making reforms work, the need for practical support.
And that call again for policymakers to do no harm, empower local educators.
Flex those real-world experiences.
So, given all these potential federal shifts, What were some strategic responses being considered by educators and institutions?
Well, groups like Education Council and NSAC stress staying informed, tracking legal challenges, policy changes,
Makes sense. Be prepared.
and advising schools to align curriculum with policies, but without sacrificing academic integrity. That's a fine line to walk.
How would they do that?
Maybe careful framing of topics, ensuring diverse perspectives are still included, focusing on evidence-based practices, primary sources, critical thinking, adjusting but not gutting.
Okay.
Also developing strategies for handling student questions within the new guidelines, building support networks for educators, documenting curriculum changes meticulously.
So maintaining integrity while ensuring compliance.
Exactly. Using critical thinking, inquiry-based learning, especially around sensitive topics like race and identity, aligning materials with federal, state, and local policies. Professional development on legally sound teaching strategies was seen as key too.
And FERPA, PPRA compliance, always important.
Right. Using Socratic methods, evidence-based inquiry, integrating historical facts are relevant.
And finally, we saw major pushback from teachers' unions, didn't we?
Oh, yeah. AFT head Randy Weingarten was very critical. Unions were part of broad coalitions challenging the EOs and proposed cuts.
Like the LA Teachers Union defending students during immigration crackdowns.
It really highlights the deep concerns in the education world about the direction of these policies and their potential impact.
So wrapping this all up, wow, we've covered a huge amount of ground. The real complexities around school discipline.
It's a push for reform, for equity.
And these really significant, often very contentious shifts in federal education policy via executive orders.
And the tensions are just so clear, aren't they? Local control versus federal guidance, addressing disparities versus promoting merit. These fundamental disagreements about what works for discipline, for DEI, no easy answers anywhere.
Absolutely. So thinking about all these sources, all these viewpoints, what do you think stands out as the most critical challenge facing U.S. education right now? And maybe more importantly, what kind of solutions might actually work to create learning environments that are equitable, successful for all students? What's the right balance between federal policy and state and local control in navigating all this complexity? Definitely gives you a lot to think about.